Picture a jester. Go ahead, close your eyes and see him. Bright colors, bells that jingle with every step, a painted smile stretched across his face. He dances, he jokes, he makes the king laugh. That's the image, isn't it? The one we've been fed since childhood. The harmless fool, the court clown who existed only to entertain. But here's what that image doesn't show you. The jester is standing in a room full of people who could have him killed. Not arrested, not exiled, killed. One wrong joke, one moment where the laughter stops and the silence begins, and he's done. And everyone in that room knows it, including him. His smile isn't painted on as decoration. It's painted on because his actual face, the one underneath, can't be allowed to show. Because if it did, if anyone saw what he was really thinking, really feeling, the bells would stop ringing permanently. The jester wasn't respected. He was tolerated. And tolerance is not safety. Tolerance is a leash. It can be yanked tight at any moment. He existed at the very center of power, surrounded by men who could destroy him with a word, and his only protection was to keep them laughing every single day, no matter what. That's not a job, that's a trap. And some men, when you trap them long enough, they stop trying to escape. They start looking for other ways out. Now let me tell you what people don't talk about when they talk about jesters. The nobles hated them. Because here was a man, often a commoner, often disfigured or disabled, who had been handed a privilege that noblemen would kill for, the right to speak freely. The jester could mock the king to his face. He could expose lies. He could say the things that would get anyone else hanged. And worse, he was required to do it. That was his job. To be the voice of uncomfortable truth, wrapped in jokes so the king could pretend he was still in control. The resentment was choking. You could feel it in the room whenever a jester spoke. The way the lords would smile, but their eyes wouldn't. The way they'd laugh, but their hands would tighten into fists under the table. The clergy despised jesters too. They saw them as blasphemous, agents of chaos, men who made a mockery of order, hierarchy, God's design. Some priests refused to give jesters last rites. There are records of jesters being buried in unmarked graves, denied Christian burial, their souls condemned because their profession was considered inherently sinful. Imagine that. Imagine being told that your existence, the thing you do to survive, damns you. But the cruelest treatment was reserved for the natural fools, the ones born with disabilities, dwarfism, developmental disorders, physical deformities. They didn't choose to be jesters. They were made into jesters, kept like pets, paraded in front of guests, forced to perform. And when they couldn't perform, when they were tired, or sick, or simply too humiliated to continue, they were punished, beaten, starved, locked away. There's an account from a French court where a natural fool was dressed in a bear costume and set loose during a feast. Hunting dogs were released. The guests watched and laughed as the fool ran, screaming, trying to escape. The dogs caught him. He was mauled, and when he begged for help, they let the dogs continue, because it was funny. Jesters weren't people. They were toys, broken toys that made noise, and when the noise stopped being amusing, the toy was thrown away. They were laughed at in public, and despised in private, every single day of their lives. Jesters didn't just see violence, they were soaked in it. Courts weren't peaceful. They were slaughterhouses dressed in silk. Executions happened in courtyards. Torture happened in dungeons directly beneath the halls where jesters performed. Political enemies were poisoned at dinner tables. Riots broke out in the streets, and jesters were sent out into them, bells jingling to deliver messages or calm crowds, or simply to see what would happen. They were present for all of it. They watched men hang. They watched men burn. They stood in rooms where conspiracies were planned and coups were carried out, and they were expected to keep performing through all of it, to keep smiling, to keep the king entertained while the world bled around them. And sometimes, more often than history likes to admit, they became part of that violence. Because jesters were useful for more than jokes. They were invisible. They could go places others couldn't. They could speak to people without raising suspicion. They could carry messages between rival factions. They could whisper warnings. They could spread rumors that would destroy reputations, end careers, or start wars. And if a jester delivered the wrong message to the wrong person at the wrong time, if a lord didn't like what he heard, the jester was beaten, imprisoned, sometimes killed, and no one mourned him, because he was just a fool, replaceable. But here's the thing about being surrounded by violence every day of your life, about being forced to witness it, absorb it, carry it with you wherever you go. Eventually, some people stop being afraid of it. Eventually, some people start to use it. And that brings us to a man who understood violence better than almost anyone else in the history of the English court. A man who wore bells, who made people laugh, who was trusted, overlooked, and allowed to move freely through the castle without anyone paying attention. A man named Thomas Skelton. Thomas Skelton was the last court jester of Muncaster Castle in Cumbria, England. And if you look at his portrait, which still hangs in the castle to this day, you'll see a man in motley, holding a staff, with a painted smile. He looks harmless, almost friendly, but there's something wrong with the eyes. Tom Skelton was liked. That's the first thing you need to understand. Not feared, not whispered about, liked. He was a trusted servant of the Pennington family. He'd been there for years. He knew everyone. Everyone knew him. He was familiar. And familiar things don't get watched. The stories about him paint him as a prankster, a lovable old fool who liked to play harmless jokes, cutting off the branch he was sitting on, greasing the banisters so guests would slip, quipping that everyone had a hand in it when asked who was responsible. Funny stories, light stories, the kind that make you smile and shake your head. But those stories are a mask. And underneath the mask was something much, much worse. Tom Skelton had a habit. He would sit beneath a large chestnut tree on the grounds of Muncaster Castle, near the road, just sitting, watching, waiting. And when travelers passed by, strangers heading toward the coast, people who didn't know the area, some of them would stop. They'd ask him for directions. Where's the safe crossing? Which way to the village? How do I get across the river? And Tom Skelton would smile. If he liked the look of them, he'd point them toward the safe route, the solid ground, the shallow crossing where the riverbed was firm. But if he didn't like them, if something about them annoyed him, or amused him, or simply made him decide they weren't worth saving, he would point the other way, toward the estuaries, toward a stretch of mud and sand that looked solid from a distance. But it wasn't. Quicksand. The traveler would thank him. They'd walk in the direction he pointed, and Tom Skelton would sit there beneath his tree and watch them disappear into the ground. He wouldn't help. He wouldn't call out. He would just watch. How many people did he send to their deaths this way? No one knows. The records don't say. But the locals knew. The locals talked, and the locals stayed away from Tom Skelton's tree. But that wasn't the worst of it. Because Tom Skelton didn't just misdirect travelers. He recovered the bodies. Late at night, when the tide went out and the sand was firm enough to walk on, he would go back. He would dig them out, and he would take their heads. Some say he buried them under tree trunks on the castle grounds. Some say he kept them. Some say he displayed them briefly before hiding them again, just to see if anyone would notice. No one ever did, because who watches a jester? But the murder that people remember, the one that made it into the historical record, happened inside the castle itself. There was a young man named Richard, a carpenter's son. He worked at Muncaster, and he had fallen in love with Helwise Pennington, the daughter of the lord of the castle. They kept it secret. They had to. She was nobility. He was a servant. If her father found out, Richard would be thrown out or worse. But someone else had noticed Helwise. A nobleman named Sir Ferdinand. He had pursued her. She had rejected him, and when he found out about Richard, he was humiliated, furious. So, he went looking for someone who could solve his problem quietly. He found Tom Skelton. The account recorded by a journalist named John Briggs in 1825, based on local oral tradition, describes their conversation. Sir Ferdinand approached Tom on the castle grounds and asked him, casually, if he'd ever done anything regrettable. And Tom smiled. He told Sir Ferdinand a story about how he'd once told a footman that a river was safe to cross when it wasn't, how the man had stepped in and nearly drowned, how Tom had watched it happen, how funny it had been. Sir Ferdinand understood immediately what Tom was capable of, so he made him an offer. "Kill Richard," he said. "Use whatever method you like, and I'll make sure nothing happens to you." Tom didn't hesitate. He didn't ask why. He didn't negotiate. He just agreed. The next day, Richard was working in his shed, building something for the castle. It was after lunch. He was tired. He laid down to rest for a few minutes, and Tom Skelton walked in. He picked up Richard's tools, his chisel, his mallet, and he used them to kill him, slowly, methodically, while Richard was still half asleep. And when it was done, when Richard's body was lying on the floor of his own workshop, Tom Skelton called the other servants in to see, and he joked about it. According to the account, he told them he'd hidden Richard's head under a pile of wood shavings, and that Richard wouldn't find it as easily as he'd found Tom's missing shillings. He spoke about a murder the way you'd talk about a prank. He was proud of it. The servants stared. No one moved. No one spoke. Because what do you do when the jester, the harmless, lovable fool who's been part of the castle for years, is standing in front of you, covered in blood, laughing? You do nothing. Because who would believe you? Tom Skelton was never punished for Richard's murder. Sir Ferdinand kept his word, and Tom went back to his life, sitting under his tree, watching the road, smiling at strangers. And the bells kept ringing. For years, Tom Skelton's crimes existed only in whispers, in stories passed between families, in warnings given to children. Don't talk to the jester. Don't go near his tree. But in 1825, a man named John Briggs published a collection of essays in local folklore, and buried in those pages was the story of Tom Skelton, not the harmless prankster. The real Tom Skelton. The story of Richard the Carpenter wasn't the only one. It was just the only one that had enough detail to survive. There were others, travelers who asked for directions and were never seen again, servants who crossed Tom and disappeared without explanation, people who annoyed him or worse, bored him, and then simply stopped existing. The pattern was there. It had always been there, but no one wanted to see it, because Tom Skelton was a jester. Jesters don't kill people. Jesters tell jokes. They slip on banana peels. They wear silly hats. They're harmless. Except Tom Skelton wasn't harmless. He was a serial killer, and his protection didn't come from innocence. It came from disbelief. No one could imagine that the man in bells, the man who made them laugh, who sat under his tree and waved at passing travelers, was the same man who dug bodies out of the sand at low tide and separated their heads from their bodies with a carpenter's saw. It was too absurd, too unthinkable. So they didn't think it. And Tom Skelton kept killing. What's terrifying isn't just what he did. It's how long he did it, how easily he did it. How many people must have suspected, must have known, and said nothing, because accusing a jester of murder sounds insane. Even when the bodies piled up, even when the disappearances became too frequent to ignore, even when servants whispered and locals avoided the castle grounds after dark, no one stopped him, because stopping him would have required admitting that they'd been wrong, that the man they'd trusted, the man they'd laughed with, the man they'd allowed into their homes and their lives, was a monster. And people would rather let a monster keep killing than admit they didn't see him coming. Before we continue, if this story has kept you here, thank you. That means more than you probably realize. For those who want to go further, memberships are now open. It's there if you want it. But simply being here, listening to this, is much appreciated. Now, back to Muncaster. Eventually, though, we don't know exactly when or how suspicion finally turned toward Tom Skelton. Maybe someone saw something they couldn't ignore. Maybe a body washed up that couldn't be explained away. Maybe the disappearances became too frequent, too obvious, and even the protection of disbelief couldn't hold anymore. We don't know. The records thin out. They become vague, incomplete, silent on the details that matter most. But what we do know is this. Once people started looking at Tom Skelton differently, the protection that had shielded him collapsed instantly. Because it had never been real. It had never been based on loyalty, or trust, or affection. It was based on the idea that jesters were harmless, that a man in bells couldn't be a killer, that the fool who made you laugh at dinner couldn't be the same man who dragged bodies out of quicksand at midnight. And the moment that idea shattered, there was nothing left to protect him. Jesters were always disposable. That was the unspoken rule. They entertained, they amused, they were tolerated, and when the tolerance ended, they were removed, quietly, completely, without ceremony. But here's the truly horrifying part. Even after everything Tom Skelton had done, even after the bodies, the disappearances, the murders, people still didn't want to believe it. His portrait was still painted. It still hangs at Muncaster Castle today. A full-length portrait of a family servant, the kind of honor reserved for people who were beloved, valued, respected. They painted a killer, and they hung him on the wall. And for centuries, people walked past that portrait and saw nothing but a jolly old fool, because that's what they wanted to see. Tom Skelton's story didn't end with justice. It ended with silence, with a portrait that smiles down at you and asks, "Did you really think a jester could be dangerous?" And the answer for centuries was no. If you have made it this far, if you have stayed with this story from the beginning to now, then I have one small request. Comment the word bells below this video. That is all. No explanation needed. Tom Skelton is not unique. He's just the one whose story survived long enough for us to examine it. And when we do, when we really look at what the role of jester actually allowed, the conclusion is almost unbearable. Because the problem was never Tom Skelton alone. The problem was the system he existed within. A jester had access to everything. He moved through the castle freely. He approached people without suspicion. He delivered messages. He spoke to strangers. He went places no one else could go, and no one questioned it, because he was a fool, harmless, beneath notice. And that invisibility created a perfect hunting ground. Think about it. If you wanted to kill someone and get away with it, what would you need? Access, mobility, the ability to approach victims without raising alarm. And most importantly, you'd need people to dismiss you, to look at you and see nothing threatening, nothing dangerous. You'd need to be a jester. Tom Skelton didn't become a killer in spite of being a jester. He became a killer because of it. The role gave him everything he needed, the tools, the access, the protection of disbelief. And he wasn't the only one. There are other stories. Other jesters whose histories are filled with suspicious deaths, unexplained disappearances, violent incidents that were dismissed as accidents or misunderstandings. The records are incomplete. The details are vague, but the pattern repeats. Because the system allowed it to repeat, jesters were never held to the same standards as anyone else. They were expected to be chaotic, disruptive, unpredictable. So, when violence followed them, people shrugged. That's just how jesters are. When people around them died, it was written off as coincidence, bad luck, the dangers of the times. No one wanted to believe that the man who made them laugh could also make them bleed. And so, predators thrived, in plain sight, wearing bells, smiling. The fool was never harmless. He was simply ignored. And in a world where power determined who was watched and who wasn't, the people no one watched were the most dangerous of all. Thomas Skelton, the last jester of Muncaster Castle, lived and died centuries ago. His portrait still hangs in the castle. Tourists take photos of it. They smile. They laugh. They call him Tom Fool, the jolly old jester who played pranks and made people laugh. The chestnut tree where he once sat, still stands today. And the estuaries are still there, still shifting, still waiting. And if you visit Muncaster Castle at night, if you stand in the right place, at the right time, the staff will tell you that you can still hear him. The sound of bells, faint, distant, coming from somewhere deep in the castle. And footsteps, heavy footsteps, dragging something across the floor. They say it's Tom Skelton, still moving through the halls, still looking, still hunting. Because jesters don't retire. They don't rest. They just keep performing, forever. So, here's the question I'll leave you with, the one that doesn't have an answer. Did Tom Skelton become dangerous because he was a jester PR because no one believed a jester could ever be dangerous at all? Think about that. Think about the people in your life who make you laugh, the ones you trust, the ones you never watch. And ask yourself, would you notice if one of them was wearing a mask? The bells of Muncaster still ring on certain nights when no one is there to pull them. If this story stayed with you, if it kept you here until the end, then like this video, subscribe, and leave a comment telling me what story you want me to dig into next. Because there are more stories like this one, stories about people the world looked past, people no one thought to watch, and some of them are still waiting to be told.